get started. Thank you all for coming to our panel discussion on death, which is a great thing to be able to say, an open forum on death, the poet, the pastor, and the philosopher. So I will introduce briefly Dr. Ed Emmer, who is a professor of philosophy. Probably a lot of you already know these folks, but Dr. Emmer is an associate professor in the Department of Social Sciences upstairs, teaches philosophy. Andrew McHenry is a local pastor at the First Congregational Church, and Andrew and I go way back, and we traveled to Kenya together to the Happy Life Children's Home. We're thinking about doing another trip, so if you know anybody who wants to go next summer to Kenya to work with orphans at Happy Life, yes, you can talk to one of us. Amen. And then Dr. Kevin Rabas is an award-winning and award-losing poet. And he called himself that, so that's coming from him. He teaches English upstairs in the Department of English Modern Languages and Journalism, which he also chairs. And I'm Ellen Hansen. I'm a professor of geography and chair of the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies. So we all come from different perspectives and have interest in these issues for various reasons. It occurred to me as I was thinking about tonight's event that some of you might be dealing with issues very close to our topic for tonight. And if you are, and if you find yourself feeling like you need something after the event, I do have some resources up here that I printed out, some local places where they offer grief and bereavement counseling. Pastor McHenry, of course, is intimately connected with that as part of his work here. So if you need any kinds of resources, feel free to stay after and talk to us. What we're going to do tonight is encourage dialogue. So each of our panelists has something to say in introduction, I believe, and then we encourage questions from the audience. We also have some questions in case you're a little shy getting started. We will help everybody get started. So we didn't say who was going to go first and what you wanted to say or how long, but you know, it being a school night, we'll go for maybe an hour and see where we are at that point and cut it off then probably. So introductions, why are you here? What do you hope to accomplish? What is the most important thing you want to say tonight? So.
Andrew McHenry, I kind of had this idea. Originally, my idea was to have a pastor, a priest, and a rabbi walk into a bar. There's no rabbi in Emporia, and priests are really pretty busy these days, but the thought occurred to me, rounded off with a poet and a philosopher. Emporia, ever since the old C of E was in town, when you had two higher education institutions, and even since then, we've had this reputation of being an Athens of Kansas. There are some great thinkers in this town, and not just with the university, but certainly at the university. So I value this chance to engage in dialogue. I was motivated to talk about this. I was just trying to think of the right way to start, and gosh, we're close to Halloween, All Saints Day. This is a topic that it kind of comes up seasonally. The few churches that do observe All Saints Day, we look back and remember those who have passed on within the last year. We light a candle in their memory on our service on November the 1st. So the timing seemed appropriate for this topic. Just in general, I think the three of us agreed that it used to be the conventional wisdom, certainly in religious circles, but others as well, was that the whole of life was a preparation for what comes next, and that's for a number of reasons. That's become less the case now, but it's an excess, a symptom of that, is that people just don't think about death until they're faced up with it, because it's going to happen to each of us, whether we like it or not. So, so I thought this would be a good way to, each of us has something to offer. The other thing is, I think sometimes there's this wish for a contentious, I know more so between the philosophy and the poet's the peace guy. He's right between the two. Like I'm thinking of the movie God's Not Dead, which I have not seen and he has seen, ironically, where there's this that feeds this wish for some kind of clash, and triumph. And then, I mean,
the main character is a philosophy professor.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Remember when we talked about that, and he had the same reaction as I did to the clergy portrayal in Footloose. It's not very flattering. And anyway, so I thought this, this is more of a chance where we can dialogue. Each of us has something to contribute. Each of us intersects with this, and to have a Christian voice alongside the voices that interplay with that, I value this opportunity. So I'm glad that the idea came, and glad that everybody was game to do it. Glad for our moderator to keep us behaving between ourselves. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm not necessarily, in this case, a person of philosophy or theology. I'm kind of in the middle. I represent an art form, which is poetry, and so, but it's great to be here. Many bits in these two fields come from poetry. Like, for instance, the Psalms are poetry. Most people would agree. There's a Nietzsche work called The Gay Science, which is a bunch of poems. There's Nikos Kazantzakis tract called The Saviors of God. And all these things are poetry. So I come from a craft-making, art-making field, and so I'm not necessarily tied to a philosophy or theology when it comes to this. So it's interesting for me to be here. I do write a lot of poetry, and some about spirit and philosophy. And for instance, right now I'm teaching the meditative poem in my advanced poetry class, which used to be a poem which was a prayer to the Creator. It was a prayer, and now and there are forms of it that are simply like mind mapping or following the path of the mind with words. So there's that huge spectrum, and so I feel privileged to be here among these folks who have looked deeply into this, and I have looked at it through my art, and so that's kind of why I'm here.
Yeah, well, I was invited by these rascallions to join in on this conversation, and I'm glad to. And I think there are many places of meeting between these different fields. In fact, some of the earliest philosophical passages were written in meter, were written as poetry. It was Empedocles, I think it was. He was famous for jumping into a volcano to show that he was divine. I'm not sure if anyone was convinced, but okay. You gotta do what you gotta do. Yeah, there's so much to draw upon. I really just look forward to the conversation. Yeah.
Well, being the moderator, I'm going to take a privilege here of asking the first question, because some of these questions are really interesting. All of these questions are really interesting. But to all of you, and I guess when you have questions, you can ask them to one or all of our panelists here, because you will obviously get different perspectives from all of them. So to all of you, this question: discovering and facing up to the reality of death and mortality is part of life for all of us. You've already said. How did this happen for you, if it has happened for you, and how has it impacted what you do in your discipline? So you've all sort of addressed that a little bit, but a little bit more with that idea of the reality of death for you in a personal way. So anybody?
For me, I think the first time it hit home was with the passing of my great-grandmother, who was a very visible person in our family. And there was nothing tragic about her death. She lived to be in her late 80s. I was maybe 12 or 13 at the time. I knew about death certainly from before then, but this was the first time that it was a personal blow, and it had the consequence of making me a devout Christian with the sort of the framework that had been laid with the mainline church that I was raised in. I knew there was a God. I knew I was going to meet him up someday, and I wanted to be on good terms with him when I met up with him, and that kind of got me started. How it plays into my work today, pastors work with people on all ends of death, even sometimes being right with them when they die, but more commonly being around people at the funeral, doing a memorial service or a funeral. And I always keep in mind with that, and I get requests both from within the church and then outside the church, people in the community who just want a service. And no one ever comes to a funeral to hear the preacher preach, on the one hand. On the other hand, our job is not to be biographers or historians or God forbid, to do a service of worship of the deceased person. But we want to give, I believe in extending the same grace that I would want whenever I die. And so we want to do a good memory that's true to the heart of the person who lived, but also something that proclaims the core of our faith. I found it's helpful to sit down with the family a few days beforehand and just take notes. And I'm a person who gravitates towards history just by my nature, so I'll want to know about the core details, when they were born, what their family was like in childhood, when they got married, what their family was like that followed that, what the big things they did in life were, how they'll be remembered. I try to take a summary of it and then try to find some way out of that that illustrates the Christian conviction and then proclaims that, and in a way that offers comfort. And then we intermingle that with some songs, some prayers. Sometimes the family likes to get up and share. And then I found it's important to follow up in the aftermath of it. For example, if someone has lived, if someone's been married for 30 years and they're used to celebrating their anniversary every year, but if they've just lost their husband, people aren't going to typically send a card for happy anniversary. Yeah, so but the date's still on their mind. That day weighs with them. So I keep a log now of birthdays, the day when the person passed, the anniversary, and depending on the person and my relationship with, and you don't have to be religious to do this, by the way, but depending on my relationship with the person, I'll either call or I'll send a card, and people really appreciate that when you remember that day for them. So that's some of what I do.
Well, I guess my first experience with this was much like yours, in that my great-grandmother, who was 92 and was she was one of the operators with the little cords that they used to use when the Titanic sunk, and that was one of her things. Just she had heard these people willing things over the switchboard, and when she passed, a plane flew over and wobbled its wings. Her son was a flyer, and so that was something that was really beautiful. We were out there at the cemetery, and somebody flew over and wobbled his wings, which is the kind of like hello thing for people who fly airplanes. A friend of mine died just a few years ago who I was in a band with, and that was pretty sad too, and strange to see some of his musical rivals show up and play at his funeral. So there was that too, and that brought a little bit of closure. The darkness and the weight of death is something that can be grappled with in art and in poetry, and so we try not to forget that as we are writing. Not all things are light and shiny, happy, that sort of thing. But I think those were my first the experiences that come quickly to mind when I think of that. My great-grandmother's death, and then my band member Joe Parrish's death just a few years ago. As a band member, you spend a lot of time with this person in musical conversation, and it's almost, you have a kind of communal, deeper relationship with that person through the music. And plus, I gigged with him probably twice a week for 2 years. So those are a couple of bits that I remember, and I don't know, I know that turned me inward, and I thought about that. Also, I had been in the hospital a couple of times and have faced death in those cases. I had a head injury. I was knocked down in a pickup basketball game. I had bleeding in my brain, and I couldn't teach for about 9 months. I even considered going back to drumming because I could do that. And I also had a spinal surgery where they thought I had a lymphomatic tumor, and that wouldn't have ended well either. So I had a couple of soul-searching moments in and around the hospital. And in many ways, I turned more seriously to poetry at that time. I was studying to take the LSAT, and about 7 days before I was to take that law entrance exam, I was knocked down in this pickup basketball game, and I could not do the word problems, the logic problems. There are 3 red books, 2 green books, and 1 yellow book. The yellow book is always by the red book, and that sort of thing. Couldn't do them to save my life, and said, I'm writing poetry, why don't I do that? So, yeah.
Does that really influence the direction of your life?
Yeah, I could be over there at the courthouse and I think this is more fun.
Yeah, I guess when I think about my relationship to death, on the one hand, when I was a teenager, I was just a really angsty teenager, and so I was thinking about death and what's going on and trying to figure everything out all the time. And so that was one of the things that was weighing on me. But in our conversations that we had as we were getting ready for this, one of the topics that we talked about was this question of how much you do or don't face death, how much you push it away or how much you face it. And it made me think this question right now about how when I was very, very young, we had a cat and the cat got hit by a truck. But then after it had been hit, what happened was it was put in a cardboard box. And then the question was, were we as kids going to go look at her or not? And at the time, I didn't have the guts to look in that box. So there was this cardboard box that was full of death, and I wouldn't look. I didn't have the bravery to look in that box. Not that long ago, my mother died, and I would say that in general, that it also refocused me again. I think a lot of us need to be refocused again and again on appreciating the people that we do have right now. Basically, other than death itself, one of the main reminders of that is a lot of movies have that as a theme, you know, be awake to what's going on. But then, of course, when the movie ends, you tend to forget about it, you know. You think about it for maybe that evening, and then you tend to forget about it. And so what I've been bringing into my classroom, and we'll probably talk about a little bit later on, is Stoic techniques. They're techniques that you try to use on a daily basis to keep yourself focused on those things.
Questions from the audience for any of our panelists or all of them? Just raise your hand if you have one. Yes.
What about facing death when somebody has just learned they have terminal cancer, whether they're Christian or non-Christian? How do you deal with that? What kinds of things do you look at with them?
When there's a diagnosis, we use prayer, as we do with a lot of health issues. The issue, I'll visit with people either in counseling them. Sometimes it'll come up in church. If I found out something secondhand, I will give them a call. We'll offer our support. I try to, I want to, there's a conventional wisdom, at least among some pastors, that when they come to church, when people come to church, that's your opportunity to speak to them. Other times, though, you don't impose the sermon on them. You want to listen. So I want to, try to hear them out and hear how they're processing. And some people, for some cases, their sense of their relationship with God is strong. There's, in Christian circles, we would call it the doctrine of assurance. Although even then, even when you have that, there's still no matter, I think of the time when I first went on one of those roller coasters at Worlds of Fun, I knew I wasn't going to die on it, but I see the chicken exit over there and it's a strenuous thing, and so there's still that element of fear even when you have a real strong religious backing. So we stand together. We're stronger in numbers. We pray together. That helps. That offers encouragement, and that's important to think through issues, both the spiritual issues and then the practical issues, so the family is not left behind with a big mess to clean up. So so it's good to talk through those things, and I just kind of try to be a presence, a pastoral Christ-like presence with people as they're going through those kinds of things.
Different perspective.
Yeah, well, I turn to the art, and that, in my case, poetry that I love and that seems to console me. So, for instance, I like the Psalms quite a bit. I also, recently, folks who are going through divorce or a bigger loss like death, a lot of folks seem to like the Coleman Barks translations of Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi, a 13th century Persian mystic poet, and a lot of folks seem to find solace in his work. He's someone who lost a lot of people, including his kind of saintly friend who was probably killed by his followers. And then he missed this person and wrote these poems of loss for that person. And so they seem to have that weight and emotional flavor. And so I like, it's R-U-M-I. I like Geraldine Rumi, especially the Coleman Barks translations, who's an American poet from Georgia who essentially devoted his poetic life to translation of this great, great poet. It's kind of the Shakespeare of the Arab world during that time. It's a shame that not more of us know of him, but those who do seem to enjoy his work and find solace in these spiritual poems.
I guess what I might talk about here, on one level, academic philosophy often is not much of a resource for somebody facing their own death or the approaching death of somebody they know. On the other hand, there are a number of contemporary philosophers who have been inspired recently by Stoicism and have tried to pick up Stoicism and revive it as a way of dealing with life and death. And this also is a sort of reminder that for the ancient philosophers, philosophy wasn't so much a theory as it was a practice. It was a life practice. And so most of the ancient philosophers have techniques and ways to try to make life better. I guess when you talked about one thing that connected when you were speaking was the idea that even though you might know that there's an afterlife, it doesn't necessarily prepare you. It doesn't mean that you won't be, you won't have emotions or feelings or won't be difficult. And in a similar way, philosophy, depending on where you want to draw the starting point for philosophy in Western culture, you could argue that it really starts in some ways with Socrates. And Socrates, one of the really very readable dialogues, Platonic dialogues, is the Apology. It's called the Apology because it comes from the Greek word for a defense in a law court. And in the Apology, he has been accused, among other things, of atheism and corrupting the youth. He's an old man when he's dragged into court by one of his enemies, and what comes to the fore is that he realizes, and he says this to the jury, that if he wanted to live longer, he could try to be, he could beg for more time, he could beg for a light sentence, but he says, look, his whole life he's been trying to teach people that you shouldn't fear death. If he's going to say one thing, that's his main message, is don't fear death. And so he felt that it would be weird for him to behave in a shameful way because of the fear of death. And that was one of the things that he impressed on his friends very much, was that he did not fear death. He seemed to be unassailable by anything. He could drink and never get drunk. Nothing seemed to get at him. But then to come back to this other side, just like you said, when you're on the roller coaster, you know it's built not to kill you, but still, the point of it is that it's going to scare you anyway. And at the end of his life, at the trial, he's condemned to death, and he must drink poison. In fact, the idea is that was the gentle way to go. If you were a respected citizen, you could drink poison hemlock instead of being, say, tortured to death. So he had this sentence.
Musical introduction.
Yes. And I just wanted to find this passage here. It's from the end of the Phaedrus, which is where, yes, the Phaedrus is the Phaedo. And in the Phaedo, it's his last conversation with his friends after he's been condemned to death. He drinks the poison, and his friends, who are followers of his, they're interested in what he has to say, and they're inspired by him. And his main message is, don't be afraid of death. And they start to cry. He's drank the poison, and he's going to die any moment. And they start to cry, and he says, "What is this, you strange fellows? It is mainly for this reason that I sent the women away to avoid such unseemliness, for I'm told that one should die in good omen silence. So keep quiet and control yourselves." Right? So what we see in this scene is that he's controlling himself, but his friends that are supposed to be, his closest followers, his confidants, the ones who would theoretically really pick up on his message, they're crying, right? They're crying. And so it can be the case that even if you believe something, it doesn't mean that the emotions will follow that belief.
Something else that comes to mind, people are different. Some are more emotional, some are less, some are more, that whole, you bring a psychologist into this, a fourth P, we have a Myers-Briggs, INF. Sometimes people react to death differently too. For some, it's kind of, and some people feel anxious, they don't want to be alone, and having somebody there by them can be helpful. On the other hand, sometimes people are, it's almost like going to the bathroom. It's something you want to have privately. I'm thinking of one case where there was it was at a hospice center in Topeka. There was at least a dozen people there, and the person was near death in a hospice bed. We all went into the room, joined hands in a circle around, and prayed, and then we all stepped out of the room. And when everybody was out of the room, that was when the person died. There was another situation where there's an older woman in her 90s. This was around 15 years ago, I'm guessing. And she was up in a hospital room, Stormont Vale in Topeka, with two family members. And I came up, and she said, "Can you pray with me?" I prayed with her, and then I left, and then just right afterwards, she passed on. Sometimes people are just kind of waiting for that right kind of cue or moment or something to happen. Tom Miller, who was he was a pastor in town, he's deceased now. He was a volunteer chaplain at the hospital for a while. He talked about a time where there were a person was dying in the bed, I think it was the mother, and the two sons were standing over the bed, one on each side, arguing about the inheritance. And so somebody said to them, you guys really need to straighten up for the sake of her. And one of them said to the other, we're right. We should. They shook hands across the way. Beep. That's when the person passed on. Sometimes there's this just moment when they need that. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot you.
It's all right. It's an emotional topic.
Yeah.
Roger.
Through time, our various societies have marked death in different ways. I think of the Victorian era where you wore black forever. I believe Jewish custom is to cover mirrors. And any thoughts on those kinds of societal accepted ways of expressing death after the fact?
This is a question that I was really interested in because I'm a geographer, so I'm very interested in how different cultures around the world deal with death and how they commemorate it, how they cope with it, etc. And there are all sorts of different expressions. I mean, do a Google search for cultural differences in death.
Believe in photograph
Stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing how different it is in different places. And somebody said that we don't talk about death like these days. It's kind of like you don't face it until you have to. But in other places, it's just it's part of the whole cycle. But and some places believe that we're reborn, and some places once your spirit has gone out of your body, it's the body's just this whole. Who cares what happens to it? That kind of thing. So geographic differences in death, the way we deal with death, are really fascinating parts of culture, and they're so different around the world. So
Yeah, I mean, that's why I passed around these photographs, was because we talked about this and this question of distancing yourself from death or denying it. And it occurred, I'd seen these pictures before. In the 1800s, after the invention of photography, people would be photographed with their deceased loved ones. And what you can see in these photographs in particular, there's one where there's a whole family sitting around and the little girl her body is there on the floor with a pillow, and the whole family's sitting around. And this was a common thing, that the family would spend time with the dead body, the dead person's body. But as you can see in these pictures, not with the distance of a casket, not with this protective wall around the body, but that they would spend time with the body physically together as if the person were right there. Another side of this was that these photographs were often somewhat expensive to have made, and they might be the only picture ever taken of that person in their life. And so this photograph would be another way to commemorate the person. You can see in a lot of these photographs, it's actually sometimes very hard to tell that one of the people in the picture is not alive, and that's intentional. You can see there's a diagram of a brace that's used to hold the dead body up as it's being photographed. Sometimes eyes were colored in on the photograph like a primitive form of photoshopping to make the person look more alive. But the main thing that strikes me about these pictures and the difference between that culture and our culture now is that they're not afraid to be directly physically with this person's body that they loved. And now it seems we have to at least have that wall of the coffin around it, even when it's open. Still, you've got that little protective fence, and it makes me think of the little cat in the cardboard box that I wasn't brave enough to look at. And it seems that we do have that relationship, that distance relationship, and I would guess that it's connected to the end of the extended family, and that when people start to die, they aren't living in the house with you anymore. The family doesn't live together. They're living off somewhere else. And so the separation is already kind of locked in early on in the course of a person's life. And I just thought I'd observe that.
There's a question over there.
Do either of you have anything more you wanted to address?
I'm
in
okay,
terms
but
of-
she has a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Actually, just to follow up on that, do you think that part of this might be because they used to treat so much more happened in the home? You know, if you were sick, a doctor came to you. Now we go to a hospital, and end of life care is in a hospital or a hospice or something like that. So that most relatives aren't seeing the whole process like they used to.
And then the body's taken to a mortuary
Right.
and it's
Someone
put in
told
that
me that they
protective-
used to call, the reason why we call the section of our homes living rooms now, the old name was parlor. And it used to be when someone passed away, they put the corpse in a casket or something, or in the parlor, and the family would come and visit in the parlor, and that term was deemed too morbid. So yeah, and I think we've become more institutionalized. In some ways, that's for necessary reasons, but yeah, that's one consequence of it.
A friend of mine came back from a trip where she'd been out traveling for, 16 months or something. She traveled around the world, she and her husband. And they came back having been to Tibet and having been privileged to be allowed to witness a Tibetan sky burial. How many of you have heard of the Tibetan sky burial? The idea is that when the spirit leaves the body, it's an empty husk. You don't need that body anymore. And there really isn't, where the Tibetans live, there isn't a lot of place to bury a body. Most people don't choose to cremate the body. So you have to get rid of this body somehow. And the religious practice amongst these people who have this practice says that the body is just this empty, no longer useful thing. So they take it to a certain place and they actually dismember the body into small pieces. And over centuries of this practice, vultures have been trained, and it's sort of genetically programmed now that these vultures come and they eat the flesh from the bodies. And my friends, I don't think they knew about this practice before they went to that part of the world. And so they were sort of shocked but fascinated, as you would be. But it's not shocking or something object of fascination for the people who practice it. It is a really practical way to deal with a dead body. You know, you need to have some place to put it. Well, where you put it is into these animals who eat it. And Native Americans in some places have similar practices where they put the body on a platform in a tree and it's consumed by animals. So those kinds of practices we find somewhat kind of shocking and not pleasant to think about. But again, they're just very practical sorts of ways that people have come to terms with dealing with death and bodies.
Kind of piggybacking off that, this relates to the question that came from Roger. The bereavement specialists who've trained pastors and others emphasize the value of ritual and repeated rituals to help for the grieving process. So in contrast with like what's been called the West Coast trend, I don't know if that's fair to people who live on the West Coast, but of just not doing services, which can be kind of just an avoidance thing. There's a family I know, their son died when he was 18. I did his funeral, and every year on his birthday, they get together and go to Red Lobster because Red Lobster was his favorite restaurant. So, things like that, that's more appealing to me than going vultures and all that. But hey, the good Lord makes us different, so.
That's right, differences around the world. Michael.
I have a middle-aged guy question, which I think all three of you are well qualified to help.
They're all very young.
I know, they're my age. At this point in life, my experience has been we become very preoccupied with this idea that our life expectancy is a function of our habits. And statistically, that's true. Don't smoke, wear a seatbelt, watch what you eat. If you drink, do it in moderation. Develop a low-impact exercise habit. Every single one of those things statistically does correlate with a longer lifespan. That is correct. But people aren't statistics. I think of the famous Chicago newspaperman, Mike Royko, was a hard-smoking, hard-drinking, old-school newspaperman who looked himself up once on a life expectancy table and discovered that he had died 3 years ago. Not as funny. My wife's uncle, who was a marathon runner, recently died of natural causes at 62 years old. So on the one hand, we want to, and our doctors want to embrace all these positive habits. And again, I'm not advocating anybody leave here and take up smoking or anything. Statistically, it works. But how do you balance that with the fact that there is an element of randomness there too?
A verse that I quote at funerals a lot is, "We do not live to ourselves, we do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So that whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's." It's Romans 14:7 and 8. And that's applied in the context of a discussion over meat offered to idols. The point being that, it's not just about self-care and self-promotion. So you can go to two excesses. One is to, a long life becomes almost an idol in and of itself, where, these vessels are not made to live forever. And sometimes I wonder if I even really want to live to be 100, having ministered to people who've lived that long, and really, it gets to a point where even, especially if you've lost children, you wonder, why am I still here? What does God have in store for me? That kind of a thing. The other extreme, though, is you can be so hard living and raucous that you lose sight of the fact that your life matters to other people. I did a funeral for a guy who committed suicide a number of years ago. I had the sense from talking to his family that he felt like, just go on without me. You'll be better that way. I don't want to hurt anybody. I'm just going to go off. He wanted to just fade off into the sunset. You can't do that. Our lives are all interconnected, and there's interdependency. And even the most antisocial person, there's people who have a relationship with you. Your life means something. So there's kind of a balance to be found in there, I would say, if that makes sense.
Other thoughts before another question?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I actually remember the thread that brought me to look these passages up. But these are passages from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Basically, they're passages from his personal diary, where he was trying to be a good philosopher, a good Stoic, and therefore live a good life. Some of these phrases could sound a little harsh, but one, he says to himself, quoting an earlier Stoic, "You are a little soul bearing up a corpse." And that idea is meant to remind a person that they're born to die. The Stoics often tried to remind themselves of their own mortality, precisely so it would be less frightening, and so they could get used to it. And so instead of pushing it away so that it appears in short, terrifying moments, you keep it before you on a daily basis so that you're used to it and see it as a natural process. I think it was Michael who mentioned that you might try to plan to make your life longer and then it gets shortened. And an idea that the Stoics often brought to the fore was the idea that you treat your life as if you're an actor on a stage. He says, nor is basically a good Stoic philosopher, nor is his life incomplete when fate overtakes him, as one might say of an actor who leaves the stage before ending and finishing the play. The idea is that you're in a play and you don't know when the end of the play is, but it's been written by the playwright. And so if you're going to do a good job as an actor, you're going to carry out that play and you'll give it a good ending, basically. Sometimes people have this, they pick up this phrase, carpe diem, live for today, but for some people that means just go out and party. For the Stoics, it means live each day so that your last day, whatever one it is, would be an honorable one. And so that means if you live every day as if this could be your last day and you want it to be a good ending to your story, then you'll have a good life.
My only answer to this question is kind of cheesy, but it comes from Ray Bradbury. There's a story, I think it's called something like End of the World, and people see the end of the world coming. I'm going to modernize it so we get it. And some folks go skydiving, and some folks go cave jumping and diving and that sort of thing. Others go on roller coasters, others have sex, others have a whole lot of beers. And this one older couple just does what they always do every day. And that sort of speaks to it. That's the people he follows, the ones who decide they're just going to live this day like they lived every other day, and it will end in finality.
Yeah, interesting. You had a question.
I'm not sure how to ask it. Culturally, we know what fear is and we know what death is, and we automatically put them together. Your opinions, what is there to fear in death from each of them?
I'm one who believes in both eternal life and eternal death, as the Bible proclaims. I believe in the literal hell. So I don't believe in using fear to try to manipulate people religiously, but I think that's something to think about. And I think the way that fear is conquered is in faith in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. With that also, I'd say, I think there are times where death kind of comes in an untimely, in a way that multiplies tragedy. I mentioned the fellow who committed suicide. I think there are other times where there are accidents and people just aren't prepared for it. That's, and I think sometimes the method of death, talked about Socrates and Hemlock, or there are brutal ways of dying. In the United States, somewhere around, something that grieves me is that somewhere around between 30 and 35,000 people die in car accidents every year. If we had better mass transportation, we don't have to live this way, and we shouldn't, especially when. By the way, I'm trying to get Amtrak to stop here. I think there are there's physical pain. There is a redemptive value of suffering, but that doesn't mean we want to promote or encourage suffering. That's the first thought that comes to mind, maybe not the best one.
So is the question about fear of death then, or?
Yeah, why do we automatically label death with fear? I mean, individually, not simply culturally. Some cultures don't, some people don't. But why is that? I have an understanding of it, and I can put words to it, but I'm asking for yours.
Okay. Well, terms of literature, my favorite contemporary work about that is called White Noise by Don DeLeo, in which a person creates a pill that alleviates or illuminates the fear of death. Eliminates or alleviates. So you don't fear it anymore by taking this pill. Then, of course, people fight over it. And it's a comical novel, but its earlier title was going to be The American Book of the Dead. So you might check it out if you're interested in that. The band Airborne Toxic Event gets its name from that novel, so it has some influence. It's kind of interesting. There's a gaseous cloud that comes from a poison spill that comes over this town, and everybody has to split, and they wonder, are they affected by it? But anyway, that novel grapples with that in a way that I can't get to in about 2 or 3 minutes. But I like that as an absurd examination of our fear of death, that we would buy some pill and do almost everything we could to take this pill so we would not fear it. If we were a little more stoic, we probably wouldn't have this problem. I think in some ways the thing that redeems my own thought process when I think of fear of death is the process of memory. There are other people around us who will remember us, and we will remember them in turn. And so whether you believe in an afterlife or not, there's always that memory of you and the people you love that survives. There's a poem I have that gets at that. It's by Ted Kooser. I'll only read a little part of it. He was the poet laureate of the United States and was Nebraska's great poet. He was an insurance man, which you might not think there'd be a poet there, but Walt Stevens did that too. There are others. That was his day gig, and this is a poem about the loss of his mother when his mother died. And this is the very last of it. There's a whole lot before it, which is about looking at flowers. She loved flowers. You asked me if I would be sad when it happened, and I am sad. But the iris I moved from your house now hold in the dusty, dry fits of their roots green knives and forks, as if waiting for dinner, as if spring were a feast. The flowers replanted at his house. I thank you for that. Were it not for the way you taught me to look at the world, to see the life at play in everything, I would have been lonely forever. So there's a little part of a poem by Ted Kooser. And you can see there's the literal living on. Her plants are living at his house. And then there's the metaphoric. The memory of the way she looked at the world lives on in him, in observation and seeing the beauty in the flowering things. So that sort of thing consoles me. Yeah.
There's another philosophical movement, ancient philosophical movement, the Epicureans, and they felt that people, one of their concerns was, again, this fear of death, and they felt that people feared death because they were afraid that it involved suffering, particularly in the afterlife. And they basically said, well, no, when your soul and your body come apart, they're both destroyed. So there is no afterlife. And it maybe is a bit too glib, or at least the way I'm putting it, it's a bit too glib, but they basically said, look, when you're alive, death is nothing. And when you're dead, life is nothing, so there's nothing to worry about. They would say things like, well, notice that you aren't afraid of the fact that you weren't alive before you were born. And once you're dead, you won't feel anything, so there's nothing to be afraid of. If that works for you, then that's great, though it might seem a little glib, a little too easy. Other people have thought that perhaps really what people fear is not this nothingness of death, but the fact that they won't be coming back. Because the Epicurean said, well, it's nothing worse than going to sleep. You're not afraid of going to sleep. Well, that's the thing. You go to sleep knowing you're going to get up again, right? When you die, then the idea is that you're not going to wake up again. So that's what people might fear is the idea that nothing more will happen. So again, I tend to prefer the Stoic outlook. They basically didn't believe in an afterlife. Well, that's the whole thing about this revival of Stoicism is the original Stoicism has a number of so-called metaphysical beliefs, which most people who revive it today leave behind. one of the metaphysical beliefs they had is that the entire universe goes through exact repetitions of everything that it did, which means on one level, you will have an afterlife, but of course you won't know that because you're erased in between, and then it starts over again, you're born again. To you, you feel like a new person. So I'm not sure that's very consoling. Perhaps not very consoling. But again, they try to focus on the idea that death is natural, it's to be expected. And of course, they also have this kind of macho thing they're doing because they want to say the person who's afraid of death is not being noble, and we should be noble. Right? So there's an idea of self-respect. I'll leave it at that for the time being.
One more thing, I found myself perusing Mark chapter 5 the other night, where Jesus heals Jairus' daughter, and two things you said kind of brought that to mind. The disciples are saying people are saying she's asleep, or Jesus says she is asleep. She's not dead. She is asleep. And kind of the point that comes from that is we don't get scared about going to sleep. We know we're going to wake up. His words, in a way, bid us to think of death as a sleep, that we come to life again. And the core verse in there that's really stuck with me, I preached a sermon on it 10 years ago, is Mark 5:36, where he says, "Do not be afraid, only believe." That's such a versatile line of thought. And Mark's, I don't have time to go into it, but in Mark's gospel, it's kind of applied in two ways, of faith conquering fear. So. Because it is an inherently scary thing in some ways, even when you have, the word stoic is sometimes, and this has been helpful for me to hear. You hear the word stoic and you think of it as like someone pulling up their bootstraps or whatever. There's a lot more depth to it than that. There's people who want to have kind of this macho glib, but fear is a natural emotion. We're all human beings, and we all face it in some way or the other.
And Hamlet's not really an interesting play without that speech about the undiscovered country, the thing that we cannot know what death will be. Well, some of us can't, but I'll count myself among those.
Who can't know?
Yeah, well, who do not know. You never know. I might figure it out. So somebody shows me.
Well, it's interesting to think about the difference when you have faith about what's going to happen next, and when you don't have that faith, and where does fear come in there? Are you more afraid when you don't know what's going to happen next, and that fear of the unknown, which is often cited as the main fear people have of death? If you don't have a religious faith or some other kind of faith that tells you what's going to happen next. And it's interesting to be with a person. My mother was very religious, and I was there with her when she died, and she had complete certainty about what was going to happen to her next. And I had absolutely no certainty about what was happening to her, except that she was going to die and she would be gone from me. And it's interesting to think about the difference in our two perspectives, as she was dying and I was sitting next to her. I thought about it a lot, So you were going to say something.
I'm just going to pick up on one idea here from the Stoics, which is that they meditate on death a lot, they think about death a lot, but one of the things that they do, in fact, is to meditate on death, not to make themselves afraid, but to actually inspire themselves. There's a passage from early on in the meditations, and this is a passage where he's writing to himself. Again, he's writing notes to himself. He's kind of shaking his finger at himself, saying, "You're not being a very good Stoic, be a better Stoic." And so he says, remember how long you've been putting off these things, and how often you received an opportunity from the gods, and yet do not use it. You must now at last perceive of what universe you're a part, and from what administrator of the universe your existence flows, and that a limit of time is fixed for you, which if you do not use for clearing away the clouds from your mind, it will go, and you will go, and it will never return. So the Stoic uses the idea of approaching death to basically put some fire under their butt to get up and get things done, because the time is limited, and if you want these things to be done, you've got to get up and do them. it's something that I thought I might mention since there's questions of afterlife and God and these sorts of things. One of the things I think that philosophy, reading different philosophers, shows you, which anthropology might do as well, and visiting other countries to see is that some things that you think people always must think together or always must think apart, some people think apart or together. So for instance, the Stoics, they believe that everything is material, and that basically they don't believe in an afterlife, but they're not atheists. They believe that God is physically present in everything. So you can be a materialist and not be an atheist. Right? Likewise, there are some atheists who, though they don't believe in God, they do believe in an afterlife. So different things that you might think are necessarily together or apart may not be in other people's minds. And so it's sometimes interesting just to see what the possibilities are for ways to think about things.
Something I say at almost every funeral I do is the good Lord keeps us around for a reason. So long as we're alive and breathing, it's a sign that God's not finished with us yet. I value that notion of, we've got some time here. Each of us has a purpose, something to accomplish. Sometimes it's, I hope it's helpful. It comes to mind when I visit nursing homes and I run into older folks who, why am I still here? I try to encourage them with that hope. But each of us, as long as we're here, we have something to offer. And I guess part of the ministry of something, or any person who wants to do some good, to give people a sense of that purpose. Listen to somebody's story, give them a chance to contribute something that can give them some value for the day. I find myself around older folks praying that somehow each day there would be some source of blessing, a word that is said, something they can do, that would offer a blessing to somebody else. That's important as you get older, having something to offer to the world. Yeah.
You had a question back there.
So some people do believe in an afterlife, and some people do not believe in an afterlife. My question is, seeing as there's two sides of that, what is the purpose of an afterlife? I know there's a couple different types of afterlife. People from different cultures view it differently, different religions view it differently, but also people live on through history and people live on through memories. I just was wondering what the purpose of afterlife was.
In the Bible, two thoughts come to mind. One is judgment, and another is reward. And that is informed through a doctrine of grace. The idea is we've all made our share of mistakes. We think of people in dualisms, Adolf Hitler is one extreme, Mother Teresa of Calcutta is the other. The reality is all of us, and even the people who are remembered as the most saintly, collective memory is kind of a funny thing. And we all have our faults. And so God in his grace has extended, reached out, and we Christians believe through Jesus Christ so that we can have eternal life, eternal hope. And then reward is, even when grace kind of is a level playing field, there's this concept of rewards looking back on what has been done. Jesus speaks of each life. He tells parables of people given certain amounts of money. And the man who had 5 talents brought back 5 more. The man who had 3 brought back 3 more. The one who had 1 was scared. He buried it in the ground. There's fear again. Yeah. Don't be motivated by fear. Use whatever the good Lord has given you to make a difference. And then the word Jesus uses at the end is that's the parable. Well done, good and faithful servant. That parable comes up in. I'm juxtaposing a couple of them there, but I'm thinking of Matthew 25, 31 through 46. So it kind of motivates on both ends.
Yeah, there's lots of different conceptions of the afterlife, and many of them. So Plato, for example, tells stories of the afterlife, but in a different way because he tells stories of reincarnation, that we come back again. But he does include this idea of punishment and reward. And for some people, the afterlife is precisely that. It balances the scales. It gives punishment. It gives reward. I remember I saw a really interesting conversation where one person was saying that without the afterlife and the punishment and reward in the afterlife, to give ultimate meaning to what happens in our lives on earth become meaningless. And the response I thought was an interesting one, which was something along the lines of, well, you know, you eat a sandwich and it goes away, but it doesn't mean it didn't taste good. You know? So there could be a possibility without an afterlife of seeing the meaning in this one short life that you have. And again, that's what a lot of these sort of neo-Stoics focus on. One technique, I figured I would just go ahead and pass this along, that they use is what's called negative visualization. And it's the idea that you think briefly a few times a day about the fact that anything that you now have could disappear, and that any time you enjoy something right now could be the last time you enjoy it. Now, clearly, if you use it the wrong way, that can make you really depressed. But the idea, again, is to inspire you to refocus on what you have now, because it's a sort of general human tendency to get used to things, and when you get used to them, you take them for granted, and then you almost automatically want something different, something more, something bigger, something better, which means you're going to be dissatisfied right now. The negative visualization is to push you to reawaken to what you already have and how good that is. One of the strange things about our culture with advertising is that advertising takes that very tendency that seems to be psychologically built into us and then pushes it further, because most advertisements are meant to make you unsatisfied with what you now have and to awaken a new desire in you. So this negative visualization, it would be working against the effect of all that advertising and our natural tendencies. So again, this goes back to this idea that sometimes you often see a movie where that's the idea, you know, wake up, live in the moment, appreciate the people around you, tell them that you love them, but then after, you know, the next day after the movie, you forget it again. So the idea of negative visualization is 2 or 3 times a day, just briefly think for a moment, this might be the last time.
Interesting. Yeah.
I would be interested in the panel's take on the changes that have occurred in modern medicine and the ability to prolong life and the ethical dilemmas that families and physicians face.
Gosh. Life is a gift. God, we don't check our brains at the door. I think it's useful being in an educational institution. Being the church, pastor of the church that effectively founded ESU, I'm proud of that. And medicine is one outgrowth at that. And down the street, the ESU School of Nursing is just right next to the Newman Hospital, so that's good. You do run into situations, oh gosh, I think of, I mean, I can think of 2 people right now. I can think of one individual who is as healthy as any of us mentally. He can talk, you know, and cognitive, but physically he can't get around, and his life has a lot of misery. And I can think of another situation, multiple situations, where people, their mind is gone, but their body is still functioning. In some cases, they have a great amount of energy, and channeling that is a real challenge. So it becomes a dilemma. I'm not an advocate of, you know, the needless prolongation. I've seen people kind of suffer, and I've talked to people who've kind of, why am I here? That kind of a thing. So I don't believe in dragging it out, but I think there's also a slippery slope associated with euthanasia if it's taken too far, that I'd want to be cautious of, because life is a gift.
It does seem there are quite a few articles about if they ask a doctor or a surgeon what they're going to do when they come to the end, they say, when you get to a certain point, you go home and stay there. And that seems to be a humane practice if you don't have the funds, or if it looks like wasted effort to keep on that path. So in many ways, I mean, I hope I'll have the strength at a certain point when it comes to my own life to say, okay, I'm going to go home, and that's where I will spend my final days, hours, weeks, months, years, whatever. I do think about that because I spent some time in hospitals. I used to read poetry at nursing homes too. That was my gig for half a year. And so I went to 6, 7, 8 places a day and read classic poetry to folks. And some places are good, but not most of the places I went were good in terms of quality of life. And it woke me up to that.
Insofar as you're saying, sometimes it's just the fact that you're in your home means it's going to be better than if you're somewhere else.
I would hope so. I mean, if you have the means to make your home peaceful, I would say there comes a place where that might be the place to end in.
Good hospice organizations will work towards that to try to find a way to let people be at home, give some in-home care to help meet that. I've seen that happen before, and that does make a huge difference, so you don't have to go to an institution. There are some institutions there's a really nice hospice house up in Topeka, and they go to great lengths to make it be, give comfort in the last hours. So, but that said, there's no place like home, that expression. No, if a philosopher thought of that, it's not in the Bible. But it's Wizard of Oz, I'm sorry.
And I did have, this is funny but sad to go along with that. I was asked to go and give a talk for a writers group a little while ago, and I showed up and I couldn't find the address. I looked around, and it was an assisted living place. And so there I was among my fellow writers, and it was a pretty good one, so I wouldn't mind going there. But I thought it was a little too soon for me.
Hope so.
Yeah, I mean, there's an entire field in philosophy of medical ethics. I haven't really gone very far in that direction myself. But one thing that is interesting to see looking over the history of philosophy and the history of these ways of thinking is that now with these very questions, situations arise which approach the question of whether people should be allowed to commit suicide. And in the ancient world, there were a number of role models for a noble suicide. And of course, Socrates, as you may have guessed, is very close to that idea. He drinks the poison cheerfully, and in fact is berating his friends who are crying. So that's a possible resource for thinking in that direction.
Let's have one more question from the audience. Yes, sir.
Well, Pastor McHenry talked about, and he's involved with all the rituals. We have these rituals we go through, funeral service, in some cases the wake the night before, and these help us, the family members and friends, reconcile ourselves to the fact that this person is gone. Well, nowadays, so many times in the paper you see notice that a person has died and it says no services are planned. I wonder sometimes if these people think, well, if we don't do anything, then in their mind that person's not gone. Your thoughts on this?
That is a bad trend. It does not give people a chance. Coming together is good. And there are a few exceptions. There are funerals that are done poorly, but not wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's a helpful healing thing. It gives a collective time to share memories. When a memory, if you tell me a story about my great grandmother that I'd never heard before that you experienced, that brings her to life to me again. That's a good thing. So I strongly disapprove of that trend. I don't know why. I think it may be a death avoiding thing. And maybe people have had bad experience with funeral. Sometimes the person wishes for it, and you got to respect that. But that's not good that they did that. And I don't know. I can't speak for all the motives for it, but I don't care for it.
Yeah, this idea that you would spend time with the body of the deceased. In my own family, a number of generations ago, I was told that the tradition was, you would get drunk with the body of your family member. Everybody get drunk, so you have a party. And basically, getting together is a good thing, and so basically you're saying let's have less parties.
The afterlife, that question came up. In some of the Jesus descriptions, it's described as like a great feast, a great celebration. And we are going to a bar after this, aren't we?
Only if you can find a rabbi.
Well, that's where conversations like this usually take place.
Yeah. Kevin, do you have some thoughts on that one?
No.
Okay, well, we could go on for a long time, I think, talking about this topic, and it's been really interesting hearing your comments and hearing your questions. Again, I do have information up here if you want some that's about services available. I have some other information up here about cultural practices in death, and if you have questions for the panelists, they might be willing to stick around for a few more minutes. If you haven't had all your answers. I feel like we need to have a prayer now.
All right.
That's what it feels like. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. It's been really interesting.